Shroud of Turin is no forgery, rather. The shroud is a cloth that, according to tradition, was used to wrap the body of Jesus after his crucifixion.
This is the Shroud of Turin, a 2,000-year-old piece of cloth in the Cathedral of St. John in Turin, Italy. And what makes this piece of cloth so interesting is the image woven into it. It is the outline of a man with marks on his wrists and feet, exactly like the crucifixion. However, recently, 3 independent labs have managed to extract DNA from it. And when all of these results were analyzed, they left scientists speechless, because hidden within its DNA were genetic markers with no known link to any living human population, while others traced back to ancient lineages that vanished from the Earth thousands of years ago. So what have the scientists found inside the DNA on the cloth, and what does it tell us about the origins of the cloth? To understand this, we first need to look at what the Shroud of Turin actually is. Let's get into it. A cloth with history. The Shroud of Turin is a strip of linen a little over 14 feet long. Faintly visible on its surface is the image of a man with wounds and blood marks that match the biblical description of the crucifixion. It was first found in 1354 in a small church in Léré, France. A knight named Geoffroy de Charny placed it there. Pilgrims began arriving almost immediately to see the image of a crucified man printed on it. Nobody knows for certain where de Charny actually got the cloth, or if it was an actual image of Christ or a forgery. That question seemed to have been settled in 1389, when an artist confessed to painting the whole thing. But the Pope did not accept the explanation completely. This was possibly one of the biggest links to Christ himself. The Church couldn't let it go so easily. So they found a compromise. He allowed the Church to keep displaying the cloth, but only as a religious symbol, not as a proven relic. For the next couple of centuries, the cloth was moved from one chapel to another, even surviving a serious fire that scorched one edge of it. Until, finally, in 1578, it arrived in Turin, Italy, and it has stayed there ever since. Since it was first found in the 1300s, and to this day, 7 centuries later, people have argued that this is the actual burial cloth of Jesus Christ, and that the image on the cloth is of Jesus after the crucifixion. However, this is not the final verdict on the cloth. Many people believe the cloth is an extremely clever piece of medieval craftsmanship, a forgery made to look like Jesus. So what actually is the cloth? And how did the image get formed? That question got even stranger once researchers realized the image was carrying something no painting should ever contain: information about depth and distance. And that discovery happened by accident, when scientists brought in a piece of equipment nobody expected to matter at all: the machine from NASA. In February of 1976, 2 physicists named John Jackson and Eric Jumper got their hands on a piece of equipment called a VP8 image analyzer. The image analyzer had originally been built as a spin-off of the American space program by NASA. It was designed to turn brightness levels in an image into information about height and depth, the same kind of tool that was once used to build maps of the surface of the moon. This is how it works. You feed the VP8 a normal photograph of a person's face. That happens because shadows in an ordinary photo are just light and dark. They do not correspond to any real physical distance. Jackson and Jumper fed the machine a photo of the shroud as an afterthought. They were just testing the equipment on whatever images were sitting around. This time, the output did not distort. It did not give the warped mess that it should give. Instead, the VP8 produced a smooth, accurate 3-dimensional shape of a human body. The areas where the cloth would have touched the body directly came out darker. Other areas that would have been farther from the skin came out lighter. Even the engineer who originally built the machine later said he had never seen a result like it. That discovery led the two physicists to form a much bigger research effort, called the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP for short. A team of around 24 scientists from institutions including NASA joined the STURP team. In October 1978, they were given 5 straight days of direct, hands-on access to the actual cloth in Turin. The team tested the cloth with everything they had. Their official result was blunt and disappointing. They could not identify how the image had been created, and no alternative process could be proven either. STURP's own conclusion left the door wide open. So researchers turned to a completely different branch of science to try to close it. Estimating the age. In 1988, a small sample was cut from one corner of the shroud and sent to 3 separate laboratories for radiocarbon testing. The result placed the cloth's origin somewhere between the years 1260 and 1390. For a lot of people, that seemed to end the conversation completely. A medieval object from a medieval mystery, nothing more. Almost immediately, though, questions started forming around the sampling process itself. The original plan called for several samples taken from different spots on the cloth. This was done specifically to avoid the kind of error critics would later raise. That plan was changed before testing actually happened, and only one location was used. A corner of the fabric with a known history of damage and repair, including exposure to a fire back in 1532. Raymond Rogers is a chemist who had been part of the original STURP team. He later examined that same sampling area and found traces of cotton fibers woven into the sample. But the body of the shroud is entirely linen. Rogers argued this suggested the piece used for dating may have actually come from a repaired patch, rather than the original fabric. A textile expert named Franco Testore had personally approved the exact spot used for the 1988 sampling. He reportedly raised concerns at the time about unusual stitching near that same section as well. A 2026 study re-examined leftover fragments from the original 1988 testing. It found no clear chemical sign of contamination in the specific pieces it studied. No radiocarbon specialist has firmly declared the original 1988 result unreliable. However, a study conducted in 2022 by the Institute of Crystallography in Italy dated the cloth to approximately 2,000 years old. This corresponds with the original STURP study, which also dated the cloth to 2,000 years old. So how old is the cloth actually? That question sits in an uncomfortable middle ground. It could be 2,000 years old, or it could have been made between 1200 AD and 1300 AD. We simply do not know. But it does give us 2 very clear timelines. That is all that scientists needed. The idea was that if we could find the date of origin of the cloth, we could recreate it using the materials of that time. And that is exactly what happened. Trying to fake it. Luigi Garlascelli is a professor of organic chemistry at the University of Pavia. In 2009, he decided to see if he could reproduce the shroud using only tools and materials that would have existed in the 14th century. He artificially aged the finished piece using heat. The result looked genuinely similar to the real shroud at first glance, including that same reversed, negative-like appearance when photographed. It made international headlines, suggesting the mystery had finally been solved. But a closer comparison with the original image on the shroud told a more complicated story. When researchers measured the percentage of fully dark saturated pixels, Garlascelli's replica came in at around 60%. The same measurement on the real shroud's face sat closer to 23%. This was a gap far too large to explain away as simple aging. The replica also showed pigment soaking down into the body of the fibers. It did not stay confined to the very outer surface the way the original does. And Garla Shelley's version could not reproduce one particular detail found on the real cloth: the complete absence of any image directly underneath the bloodstains, a feature no attempted recreation has managed to copy to this day. This was, by most accounts, the most careful, most scientifically documented attempt anyone has made to fake the shroud using real historical methods, and it still fell short in several specific, measurable ways. So researchers eventually turned to a completely different kind of tool, one that did not exist for most of this investigation's history: artificial intelligence. What the AI found. In 2025, a team of chemical and biomolecular engineers ran modern AI models against high-resolution images of the shroud. The team studied both ordinary photographs of the cloth and ultraviolet fluorescence images. This is used to reveal chemical details invisible to the naked eye. Their conclusion lined up strikingly well with what Jackson and Jumper had noticed back in 1976. The image behaves as though it is encoding actual physical distance. It tells you how far the different parts of the body were from the cloth. We can now say with confidence that this image was not formed through direct contact with anything. What this result supports is something called the radiation hypothesis. This is the idea that the image may have formed from a short, intense burst of energy. The researchers did not claim to identify a specific type of radiation. They did not detect any energy source and did not claim to prove anything about religious authenticity. So, after 50 years of investigation, the mystery still has not been solved. And after all that testing on the image itself, science eventually turned towards something entirely different: the actual biological material still clinging to the fibers. Blood before the image. Reddish stains sit across the image in locations that match wounds described in the biblical crucifixion account. For years, researchers debated whether this was simply paint added by an artist trying to make the image look more convincing, or something else entirely. Multiple studies over the decades have been conducted to try and answer that very question. They reported finding components consistent with real blood, including hemoglobin and other trauma-related compounds. One study showed a particularly interesting detail. The bloodstains appear to sit on top of the image, not underneath it. That detail matters a great deal. It tells us that the blood was already there before whatever process created the image took place. Several researchers argue this points to a very specific sequence of events. The blood came first, and the image formed afterward. Speaking of coming first, one of the oldest and most shocking discoveries was made in 1898 by Italian photographer Secondo Pia. Pia was permitted to photograph the shroud during a public exhibition in Turin. Back in those days, you had to develop the images from their negatives in dark rooms. And when the photographer sat down to develop the images, something extraordinary happened. The negative revealed something the naked eye had never clearly shown. A strikingly detailed portrait, with facial features far sharper than anything visible on the actual cloth. Pia described the moment as overwhelming and astonishing. For the first time, people were seeing a face emerge from an image that had looked faint and washed out for centuries. That discovery raised a question that is still difficult to answer. How did a medieval artist manage to produce something that behaves like a photographic negative, centuries before photography existed anywhere in the world? Skeptics argue this might simply be an unusual side effect of the image's overall tone and contrast. It is not definitive proof of anything extraordinary, but the effect itself remains one of the strangest properties of the object. And finally, we now come to the newest and, in many ways, the strangest chapter of this story: The DNA analysis. When researchers finally had the technology to extract and analyze DNA from the shroud, the expectation was straightforward. Centuries of handling by European priests and conservators would have left a genetic record dominated by Western European DNA. If the cloth was a medieval forgery made in France or Italy, that is roughly what you would expect to find. That is not what the results showed. A team led by Gianni Barcaccia at the University of Padua published a study in 2015. They extracted mitochondrial DNA from linen fibers on the shroud and analyzed it. The genetic material they found did not belong to a single individual. It came from multiple individuals, and they showed genetic backgrounds across a wide geographic range: Western Europe, East Asia, the Arabian Peninsula, and the ancient Middle East. A 2026 metagenomic study expanded on this work. They identified genetic material from at least 14 different human beings on the cloth. The strongest single human genetic signal in the 2026 study matched the DNA of the chief researcher who collected the 1978 samples. But the earlier signals pointed consistently toward Middle Eastern and Near Eastern genetic origins, not the Western European signature you would expect from a French or Italian forgery. The geographic spread of the genetic evidence is actually consistent with what historians know about the shroud's documented travels. They say the cloth moved through the Middle East. It makes sense that it would pick up DNA from the many sets of hands that touched it along the way. The genetic record is chaotic, precisely because the cloth's history was chaotic. The DNA analysis firmly rules out the forgery argument that says a single medieval forger in Western Europe made this cloth. The cloth has clearly been in the hands of people from multiple continents across multiple centuries, and the threads have kept a record of all of them. Now here is where the title of this video becomes literally true. Because alongside all of that human genetic material, the researchers found something else entirely: the DNA that isn't human. The 2026 metagenomic study we mentioned earlier, it showed another thing: a substantial amount of DNA on the shroud that did not come from a human being at all. Animals whose genetic traces had been deposited on the cloth across centuries of storage, travel, and handling in environments where those animals were present. And their genetic traces cling to fabric the same way everything else does. Plant DNA turned up in considerable quantity as well. Some of these plants could not have reached the cloth before the post-Columbian era, and were only introduced to those regions after the late 15th century. That detail is important. It means some of the plant DNA on the shroud is younger than the cloth itself. It is deposited during later periods of storage or display. This is exactly what you would expect from a cloth that has been regularly handled and exhibited over several hundred years. So, where does that leave us? What is the simple, honest answer the DNA analysis tells us? The non-human DNA is what a geneticist would expect to find on any ancient cloth that has moved through multiple environments and thousands of pairs of hands across 2 millennia. The shroud is, in this sense, a perfect biological archive of everywhere it has ever been. Every animal that shared a room with it, every plant-based material it was ever packed near, every microorganism in every city it passed through, all of it has left a trace. What it also means is that isolating any single clean genetic fingerprint from this cloth is impossible. Whatever biological information might have been there that could tell us about the cloth's origins is buried under too many layers. Even modern science cannot separate the original genetic footprint from all of the DNA that has covered it for 2,000 years. The cloth preserved everything, and preserving everything turned out to be the same as preserving nothing useful in this situation. After nearly 50 years of direct scientific investigation, the Shroud of Turin still refuses to give up a simple answer. Every new tool researchers throw at this object, from NASA hardware in the 70s to artificial intelligence today, adds more detail without producing a final answer. So what do you think is really going on with this cloth? And will it ever be solved? Let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next mystery we dig into. We'll see you in the next one.